Welcome, everyone, to our forum tonight. I want to start off by thanking Alex Lesyk for joining us tonight. He is a candidate for St. Lawrence County Court Judge, and he is with us tonight to talk about his candidacy, to tell us a little bit about him, and then to answer some questions. My name is Bob Lattiser. I am the NYSUT Regional Political Action Coordinator for Senator Ritchie's district. And I welcome all of you who are watching tonight. So Alex, first of all, thank you for taking the time to come and sit with us tonight. I also want to put out there that an invitation was also offered out to Andrew Moses, who is running against Alex in this race. He was not able to join us tonight, but we still are very happy to have Alex in front of us tonight to answer some of our questions. So thank you for being able to be with us.
Thank you.
I want to start off by just letting you tell us a little bit about yourself and why you've decided to run in this race.
Well, thank you, Bob. I'm running for family court judge in St. Lawrence County. And first, I wanted to give a little shout out to the New York State United Teachers, both for inviting me to the forum and for all the great work that you do in our community. I'm familiar, for example, that you're affiliated with the American Federation of Teachers, which has created an organization called the People Project, which just in recent months has set up 8 hotspots where kids who wouldn't otherwise have access to the internet can now access it, which helps them with school, and that NYSUT has addressed many of the hunger and poverty issues that we have here in St. Lawrence County. By assisting with community dinners, food pantries, and clothing, including winter clothing for kids. So it's a wonderful thing that NYSUT does, and thank you for all you do. So as I said, I'm running for family court judge. So just by way of background, I came to the North Country about 33 years ago. I graduated from Columbia University, and then I went to Fordham University Law School. I came here, and my first job in the North Country was with North Country Legal Services. And 33 years ago, they assigned me to represent children with disabilities or special needs in education matters. Back then, 33 years ago, it was a novel concept to mainstream children with disabilities. And so I encountered a lot of resistance to my efforts to do that. But ultimately, we were successful. After North Country Legal Services, I moved on to become the head of the Public Defender's Office in Franklin County for 15 years. In that capacity, I handled criminal cases and family court cases in about a 50-50 split. And in that 50-50 split, I did handle all kinds of family court cases, the most difficult ones including child abuse and child neglect. After 15 years as the head of the Public Defender's Office, I moved on to St. Lawrence County, where I became the Chief Assistant District Attorney. And in that capacity, I prosecuted all kinds of crimes. But in addition to generic crimes, I also was very successful in prosecuting individuals who had committed crimes against children. And that ranged from sex crimes to even homicide. A lot of people don't know, for example, that there was a serial child killer who had killed a number of children in other counties, and she settled here in St. Lawrence County, and I was able to get a conviction regarding a child that she killed here in this county. After I was finished with as St. Lawrence County Chief Assistant District Attorney, I was then appointed to be a special prosecutor, which means that where the district attorney had conflicts of interest, I would then prosecute cases, in my situation, at the appellate level. So I won at one point 31 cases in a row in the appellate division in Albany on behalf of the prosecution. And that, again, also included cases where children were victims. At the same time as I was a special prosecutor, I was a faculty member, an associate professor at SUNY Canton in the legal studies program, where I taught many different kinds of law classes, including family law. Ultimately, my peers elected me me to be the chairperson of the business department. So I oversaw not only legal studies, but healthcare management, accounting, the business program, of course, and 5 other business programs that we had in the business school and liberal arts. After that, Judge Main in Franklin County asked me if I would return to be his principal court attorney. And so I took that opportunity. And now for the last 4 years, I have been handling family court cases from a judicial perspective instead of from the perspective of a litigant. And I believe that that makes me uniquely qualified to be your next family court judge.
Certainly a broad amount of experience in all of that, especially with your experience as an educator, which is going to lead me into my next question. So your experience as an educator, not only in your area of expertise in law and all of that, but in business, how does that help you understand the needs of children?
Well, at SUNY Canton, the youngest student that I had was probably about 17 years old, and I taught students as old as well into their 60s, perhaps 70. But the age range of 17 to 21 is an age range where somebody could be involved in family court in the perspective of a child. Now, of course, the older students could be involved in family court as parents or even grandparents. But from the perspective of a child, one of the things that I learned was how I might have to motivate some of these young students to do their work. Motivation has been a more difficult problem than I thought it would be among the younger students, but I've worked very hard at that. I've also had to deal with issues that young or older teenagers, I should say, go through regularly. Issues of sexuality, gender identity, issues of race, racial interaction. SUNY Canton is a very, very diverse community. And I had to deal with children who had disabilities at the college level and adjust my courses to be able to help those particular students work through their learning disabilities. I've dealt with students at that age who already have drug issues, and students who are caught up themselves in family court or even criminal court. So one of the things that I learned is you have to deal with these older teenagers really on a one-by-one basis. There is no formula. Some of these kids just need somebody to hold their hand. Some need a shoulder to cry on. Some need just a little push. And then there are others who need some tough love and ultimatums set. So you don't have one size fits all. You have to adjust yourself as a teacher to the needs of the student.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to move on to a question we have in regards to Tom DiNapolis, who is our state controller. He has endorsed you, and do you have any thoughts on why he placed his endorsement with you?
Well, most people know Tom DiNapolis or know of Tom DiNapolis as New York's top fiscal watchdog. Particularly, we know him as the individual who oversees our pension plans. But a lot of people also don't know that he is directly involved in school issues like watching spending in education, overseeing some district operations, school safety practices, harassment and discrimination issues, special education issues. He's involved in all of that. So in that capacity, he was aware particularly of my involvement as the principal court attorney in a family court right now. So he is aware that I actually handle the most difficult issues in family court from a judicial perspective. And excuse me for a second. And so a lot of people don't really know what a family court judge does. So just to give you a quick run through, the kind of cases that I deal with are child abuse, child neglect, domestic violence, custody, visitation, guardianship, adoption, child support, spousal support, juvenile delinquency petitions. And we now even have, in the last 2 years, we've established what's called a youth part of family court, which was created as a result of the Raise the Age legislation. So now kids who could have been prosecuted as adults in the past would instead be prosecuted in the youth part of family court with more of an idea of finding something to help them address their demons rather than necessarily just being a punitive perspective. So I think Tom DiNapoli knows that. He knows that I'm involved in all of that right now as we speak. And I think that that's very relevant to this judicial campaign.
All right, thank you. So you had mentioned earlier in your overview of your experience that you were a staff attorney at North Country Legal Services out of Plattsburgh. What did you learn that will be useful to you as a justice in that position?
Well, when I was at SUNY Canton, I mentioned that I dealt with older teens and young adults from, say, 17 to 21. At North Country Legal Services, the population that I served were younger kids. From, I think the youngest one I dealt with was 4 years old, and the oldest was probably a senior in high school. So they were probably talking 4 to 17. And I also dealt with their parents who were often very stressed because my role was to deal with children who had disabilities ranging from what you could say were minor learning issues to catastrophic disabilities. And that takes a toll on parents on their day-to-day living. So I dealt with parents at a time of crisis, and I dealt with children who felt, rightly or wrongly, that they weren't getting what they needed in school at the time. So I was able to communicate and learn to communicate with parents under stress and with children of all ages who had wide ranges of disabilities. So again, I think that that is a very important experience for a family court judge to have.
Right, thank you. My next question is a little bit more specifics that I was looking for, but what you did with people appealing Social Security disability denials.
Well, I think by now you've kind of noticed a common theme that I have of trying to help vulnerable people, particularly
Yes.
people with disabilities.
Yes.
So I did spend a lot of years both at legal services and even when I was working as public defender, I would take some time on the side and help people out who had disabilities, whose disability claims were denied. And 30 some odd years ago, the law was a little bit different than it is today, but disability benefits were denied if the government could show that there were job opportunities in the national workforce at the time. So if you're a disabled person living, say, in Hewlton or Lisbon or Madrid, the fact that if you were disabled in New York City and there might be a job available to you in New York City and you might be able to get to it using mass transit is completely irrelevant to your status as a disabled person in the rural North Country. Those same jobs might not be available here, and the ability to get to those jobs might not be available here. So I always felt that that standard that was in existence at that time was an unfair standard to the residents of our area. And so I often fought denials of disability on that basis to bring the evaluation of what's available to somebody living in poverty more on a regional level than on a national or even statewide level. And I was pretty successful at that. I'm very proud of being able to help adults with disabilities in that regard.
All right, thank you. My next question, why are you a board member for Maximizing Independent Living Choices?
Bob, you froze up on me for a second. Were you saying something?
Oh, yes. Is that better now? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
All right, perfect. My next question was, why are you a board member for Maximizing Independent Living Choices?
Well, here we go with disabilities again. I've been a member of the board of directors of Maximizing Independent Living Choices, which used to be known as the Messina Independent Living Center for the last roughly 6 years. And in what Messina Independent Living, well, first I want to backtrack and say that this is completely a volunteer position. It's just something that I've chosen to do. It's not something that I get paid for. And what Maximizing Independent Living Choices does, as the name would suggest, is we work hard to try to allow people who have various disabilities to live as independently as possible in a home setting, because I think that that's very important for somebody's dignity, their self-respect, and their connections to the community. We also help families who have children with disabilities, again, to try to alleviate some of the stresses that that deal with that. This is a little bit of a tangent to your question, okay. But I do have a friend who was born with rather severe physical disabilities, and I'm going to connect this to family court. He came from a really great family that took great care of him. But at one point, they put him in a hospital. I think it was a Shriners Hospital. And the goal was to, for the hospital to teach him how to take care of himself because his disabilities were rather severe. And so the parents, of course, had to do that. They did the right thing. And he is now in his 50s and he's an independent adult. And so they did the right thing. But he told me one time that when he was a child and he went through this, that he kind of sat there in the hospital and blamed himself and said, what have I done? What did I do wrong for my family to have put me here? Why am I separated from my family? And I think that's an idea that's very important for a family court judge to remember, because a lot of people think that if you have a family that, say, is not taking care of a child appropriately, a lot of people say as a knee-jerk reaction to simply remove the child from the home. And they forget that the child does love their parent. The parent is the only reality they know. And so removal from the home is very traumatic for the child. And so something that I want to emphasize that's important to me is that if I can find a way to provide enough services to the home in order to keep the family together and the child safe, that's a priority to me. And just relating that to my friend who was born with severe disabilities, I guess I want to thank him for teaching me that.
Sure. All right. So my next question is, you're currently the principal court attorney in Franklin County Family Court. How will that experience help you in your role as family court judge?
In a sense, that's tied to the answer that I gave in the DiNapolis question, where I gave a list of all the cases that I actually work on a day-to-day basis. So I'm not going to repeat those, but there's a couple of other things that are important to point out in my capacity as a principal court attorney. The first thing is that party politics don't matter in family court. Judge Main, who I work for, has been a family court judge for 34 years, and he is a Republican conservative judge who is highly respected. When he needed a court attorney because his court attorney retired, he reached out to me knowing full well that I'm a Democrat. And so for the last 4 years, he and I have been working together hand in hand for the best interests of the child. The child doesn't ask whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And we don't ask the people who appear in front of us, are you a Democrat or Republican or whatever you may be. Our interests are united to do what is best for the child. And I would say that well over 95% of the time, Judge Main and I have the same or similar course. Once in a while, we disagree. And of course, he's the judge, so he wins. But for the most part, we agree. And it really has nothing to do with party politics. So that's one of the important things to know. The other thing is, as principal court attorney, I have the most up-to-date training that's available in the court system. For example, just 2 days ago, I participated in a training regarding parental alienation. And what that means is sometimes in a custody and visitation case, you will hear that one parent is actively trying to alienate the child from the other parent. So I took an extensive training in how to recognize parental alienation and what I could do as a judge, if I'm elected, to remedy those kind of things when they happen. The week before, I took an extensive course dealing in resolution of custody issues in situations where there is domestic violence alleged. And that can be a very serious and very dangerous situation. Even if the child is not the direct victim of the domestic violence, that can still place a child at risk. So I take those courses on a regular basis, and they're available to me as a principal court attorney. Another thing is here in St. Lawrence County, we have to remember that we have a portion of the Mohawk Nation with its borders right here in St. Lawrence County. And so as principal court attorney, the highest court in New York State, the Court of Appeals, appointed me to be a member of the New York State Federal and Tribal Courts Forum. And so what we do with that forum is we try to resolve issues and conflicts that arise between those three separate court systems, because the tribe has many of its own courts, and it's actually working very actively right now to set up its own family court system. So that is a very interesting development that I'm looking forward to. I've been trained, for example, on the Indian Child Welfare Act, which is a special law that was created federally because of the sad history that we have of removing Native American children, and including children from the Mohawk, St. Regis Mohawk tribe, and adopting them out to non-Native families. And that has caused tremendous cultural harm to the tribe. So I'm very familiar with the Indian Child Welfare Act, where one of the major goals is to keep the tribe intact and keep children of the tribe with the tribe. So these are all very important things that I have been able to have access to because of my position as principal court attorney.
All right, thank you. So recently, the results of the audit had come out. What are your top takeaways for the concerns raised about child protection and foster care services, and what do you think can be improved as it pertains to the judicial role?
Well, my understanding is that the audit is not entirely complete yet. So I don't know that the results have actually come out. I am looking forward to seeing the results. But one of the important things to consider is that the way that DSS internal issues can be resolved does not necessarily change the way that the court will approach the best interests of the child. Ultimately, the standard of the court is what is in the best interest of the child. So let's say, for example, one of the issues that has been raised regarding DSS is the allegation that different foster parents might be paid at different levels. There are two issues in that regard. One is that New York state law recognizes that not all children are the same. And so if you have a child who, for example, doesn't have disabilities, the foster parent gets paid at a certain level. If the child has a moderate level of disability, the parent gets paid at a higher level. And if the child has a serious level of behavioral issues or disabilities, the foster parent may get paid at an even higher level. So simply saying that different foster parents get paid at a different level by itself, sounds bad as a soundbite, but it's not necessarily bad if that different level of payment is based on the condition of the child. Now, I don't know that. I'm just saying that there may be a reasonable basis for that. And I look forward to the audit disclosing whether the differences, if they exist, are for a rational basis or if it's something that has not been properly done. Other issues that have arisen are whether caseworkers should be foster parents. That's an internal decision for the Department of Social Services. It's not for the court to decide. I can tell you that there are situations where a caseworker might be related to the mother or father from whom the child was removed. And so I think it would be a heavy lift to say to a caseworker that you're not allowed to be a resource to your own family. So in that kind of a situation, there might be a carve out. On the other hand, where caseworkers are not related to the child or to the parents, then it certainly does create problems for the court, because a good defense attorney, let's say, would point out potential obvious conflicts of interest in testimony among caseworkers. But again, it's a policy decision by DSS. It's not like we have a lot of foster parents climbing out of the woodwork at midnight to take a child who's been removed on the basis of an emergency removal from their home. And so that's a decision for the department to make. And to the extent that it creates conflicts of interest for me as a judge, I'll just have to sort through it. It's not for me to tell the department how to manage those issues.
All right, thank you. Next question. What do you think of the mandatory retirement age?
I think it's absurd, to put it bluntly. I think it's a throwback to the times long ago where, the average age expectancy was somewhere in the 50s and 60s.
Right.
We're well beyond that now. So I would hope that the mandatory retirement age catches up with modern medicine and realizes that we have United States Supreme Court judges in their 70s and 80s. And so certainly I think that a family court judge in Franklin County can serve well into the 70s. But let's take a worst case scenario. That is an argument that's been thrown against my candidacy because I'm 64 years old. And under current law, a family court judge in New York is required to retire on December 31st of the year that they turn 70, which means in my case, I would have to retire on December 31st of 2027. So if I was to be elected and I would start on January 1st of 2022, that would give me 6 full years as a family court judge. So just doing the math, that's 2 years longer than the President of the United States serves. That's the same amount of time as a United States Senator serves. And it's 3 times longer than a US or state representative serves. So I think with 6 years as a family court judge, I can do a lot. And so I would hope that the voters make their judgment based on who they think is the better qualified candidate and not on who can serve longer.
Great answer. So next, I want to ask you a little bit about your views on the incarceration levels in New York State. I want a little bit of a preface as well. If you believe that incarceration rates are too high, what do you think the courts should be doing that they're not currently doing to reduce the incarceration rates? So just a little bit of a added on there.
Well, let me preface that by saying that I'm running for family court judge.
Yes.
And so incarceration, like when you're talking about state prison, when you're talking about even long sentences in the county jail, that's something that the county court judge does with criminal cases. It's not something that I would be doing as a family court judge. I do have the right to do short periods of incarceration, but that has to do with violation of court orders. So for example, let's say in a domestic violence case, I issued an order of protection, and then the person against whom the order was issued violated the order by contacting the protected party. Then I could, as the judge, impose a short jail sanction. So as family court judge, I really have no role in these incarceration rates that we're talking about. But I don't want to dodge the question. So I can tell you that I have seen in my experience, particularly when I practiced criminal law, that there was a tendency to incarcerate people for lengthy periods of time, even for nonviolent crimes, and particularly with drug crimes. I think that there's a really big distinction between a nonviolent drug user and a nonviolent drug dealer. While I have no problem with incarcerating drug dealers, I think that the first avenue that a court should consider with someone who is abusing drugs is to try to get them help and treatment for their problem. And along that line, when I was in Franklin County, I'm very proud that I was one of the founding members of the Franklin County Drug Court, both criminal and family. Drug court doesn't work all the time. Number one, the defendant has to acknowledge that they have a problem, and that's the first step. And then they have to go through the program. The program recognizes that there are relapses, that relapses are a part of recovery. You don't expect perfection right away. But I have seen both criminal and family drug courts have wonderful successes. At the same time, I've seen failures. And if there are failures, then yes, you may have no other alternative but incarceration. But I do believe that efforts should be made to provide treatment where possible in nonviolent criminal situations that are connected to drug abuse. And I say drug and alcohol.
Sure. Well, this kind of leads right into the next question, and you may have already answered some of this when I ask it again, so please feel free to adjust as you need to. Do you believe the courts are the right venue to address issues of substance abuse and mental illness, especially within family court?
I do, and as I said, about Franklin County, that I was a founding member of both the criminal and family drug courts. Now, that being said, something that I'm very disappointed about is that St. Lawrence County, for some reason that I'm not aware of, abolished its family court drug court. We still have a criminal drug court in Franklin County, actually two, a felony level and misdemeanor level, but we no longer have a family court drug court. And one of my goals would be to reestablish that, because I think it is important to work with families to try to give them motivation to reunite with their kids and for the kids to go home. And so I would like to work with families and try to help them recover. And we really don't have that kind of a program in St. Lawrence County anymore. Now, you also talk about mental health courts.
Yes.
We have not had one of those either in Franklin or St. Lawrence. It's something that I would be willing to experiment with, but I need to give you some unfortunate cold hard data. And that is that in St. Lawrence County, we have an average of approximately 5,000 filings per year. And we have one family court judge. By comparison, Schenectady has a little bit more than 5,000. But they have 3 family court judges. So one of the things that I need to do is to find a way to motivate the Office of Court Administration in New York City to take the needs of upstate New York a little more seriously and be a little more equitable to address those needs. because while I may want to experiment with a mental health court, I don't want to also give pie in the sky promises when I'm handling a 5,000 filings caseload per year. There's not enough hours in the day to add yet another court, particularly where I want to reestablish the drug court.
Next question is, what do you think the court should be doing that they're not currently doing to address racial disparities and implicit bias as it affects minors?
Well, to answer that question, let me first explain to the viewers what is meant by implicit bias, because very often when I talk about implicit bias, people get very defensive and say, are you accusing me of being a racist? And that's really not what it is. When I first started studying implicit bias, and that was within the Office of Court Administration, I attended a forum where the first speaker was a family court judge from the Bronx, and she was an African-American lady. And she introduced implicit bias by her own story, saying that for some reason that she can't explain, from the time that she was a child, she reacted with fear when she saw people who had tattoos. And so while now as an adult, she doesn't react with fear anymore, she still has a negative reaction. And so she explained that she is aware that she has this quirk in her personality. And so when people appear in her court and they have tattoos, she takes an extra step where she questions herself, in private, of course, not on the record, and saying, is the decision that I am making, would the decision be the same if the person in front of me was somebody who did not have tattoos? And that's the way that she explained implicit bias. And so, as I sit here and I look at myself, you may have, or a child may have a grandfather who they love very much. And if they look at me, they might see a gray-haired man that looks a little like their grandfather. And their grandfather might have certain beliefs and certain attitudes and certain quirks, and the person would possibly imply that I might have those same beliefs and those same quirks. That's implicit bias. So it's not something where we're wagging our finger at somebody and accusing them of being prejudiced. What implicit bias is about is asking us to look at ourselves objectively and ask that extra question. And just as an example, there was a study a little while ago where if you had, say, a white individual walking in an area that they're not used to, and they have a choice of asking a group of Black people on one side and white people on the other side for directions. The study showed that the white person was much more likely to approach the white group, and the Black person was much more likely to approach the Black group. That doesn't mean that someone's going to be shouting racist at either one of them. It just means that sometimes people tend toward people who look like themselves. And so all that implicit bias asks people to do is to look at themselves objectively and to make sure that whatever decisions they're doing, whatever actions they're taking, has nothing to do with the fact that the person they're dealing with might look a little different than they do, might believe in something a little different than they do, like a religion or something like that. And that's what implicit bias is all about. So I just want to take the racism out of it and just ask people to be able to objectively look at themselves and ask that question every time. So something that the Office of Court Administration is doing is we have constant training on implicit bias and teaching us to be very careful about that. And not only with ourselves, but even with witnesses. So for example, if a witness testifies in a certain way, and the person that they're testifying about or against is somebody who might look a little different than they do, we need to step back and wonder and perhaps ask some questions to convince ourselves that they too are not being affected by implicit bias. And implicit bias cuts every way. So it's an important issue, and it's something that I want to ask myself every time. And it's not just with race, it's with gender, it's with sexual identity, it's with you know all kinds of things. I have not. I'm a little stunned lately when I see how we're categorizing ourselves now. We're categorizing ourselves as human beings in more categories and subcategories than I used to see. And I think that this categorization and subcategorization is building up the levels of implicit bias that we may have. And so we do have to be very careful, and we do have to constantly ask ourselves. And that's what I'm going to do. And I can promise people that I will ask myself every time those questions. Would I be doing the same thing if the person looked like me, sounded like me, went to worship in the same house of worship that I do? Whatever those differences may be, you have to ask yourself those questions.
So this next question is a little bit wordy because there's a lot of information involved in it. You know, women across the country have spoken out publicly about various forms of sexual harassment across a variety of industries and government, to the media, entertainment industry. Our own governor just recently resigned over that. You know, reforms are long overdue to ensure that those things are not tolerated. And what, if elected, what tangible steps will you take to ensure that sexual harassment is not tolerated in your office specifically, or in your court, at large?
Well, let me begin answering that question by giving you a little bit of my background. I'm a first generation American, and my mother basically earned her living when I was a young child by essentially mopping floors in various business establishments. And at night, she went to school and she learned to be a draftsperson. And by the time I was a teenager, she was working in the drafting department at WABC Studios. And ultimately, by the time she retired in her 70s, she was the head of the drafting department at WABC. So I grew up from deep poverty as a young child to a nice middle class living as a teenager, and then to watching my mother do very well in her elderly years. I can tell you that in the 1960s and 1970s, the sexual harassment that my mother put up with was endemic. It's bad now, but back then, her male colleagues and employers treated it almost as a right. It was a much harder, and I'm not saying it's not hard now, but for my mother being, starting with mopping floors and, being victimized as somebody who was looked down upon, to somebody then working in a environment which was traditionally a male environment, she would come home. And when I was old enough to listen and understand some of these stories, I would listen to her sometimes tearfully explain to me some of the things she had to put up with at work on a frequent basis. So sexual harassment in the workplace is something that I take very seriously. And my mother was a single parent. So I see the hurt. I saw the hurt. I saw the way she was hurt growing up. So I take it very seriously. And I will be diligent, to say the least, in making sure that anybody feels comfortable in coming and telling me if they feel that they have been the subject of sexual harassment, or for that matter, any kind of harassment. I will take those claims seriously. I will deal with them appropriately. and make sure it stops. And as far as the good news, the Office of Court Administration actually does have a sexual harassment program where we take at least one class every year that's modified. It's not the same class every year, but it's modified every year to help people recognize sexual harassment in the workplace and to teach people at every level at OCA what to do if they feel that they are the victims of sexual harassment. So I will follow those rules diligently, and I will assure that it does not happen in my offices. And if it does, it will be dealt with promptly.
Thank you. So to wrap this up, I want to give you the opportunity to just tell the people who are watching this, why should they vote for you?
Well, I have the unique experience of dealing with family court and dealing with children constantly from the time that I came to the North Country 33 years ago to the present day. There is no other candidate who currently works in family court dealing with these issues. There is no other candidate who has dedicated as much time as I have, and frankly, win or lose, that I will continue dedicating time to help people and children with disabilities. I think that I have I've demonstrated a sincere attachment to caring about and helping vulnerable people. And I can continue to do that from a judicial perspective.